It's Tuesday, so you know what that means. Coming up on Worlds Asunder.
So those were kind of my anchor locations. And then I delved into drawing a map and numbering locations. And I literally have exactly 800 numbered locations in Mesnik. And they're just little squares and rectangles and L shapes and things like that. I'm not an artist. I'm very much an engineer, and I drew the map to be functional, not pretty.
The stories we've read capture our attention and immerse our minds in settings of all kinds to bring us the spectrum of feelings and deliver the tale of tales to our starving psyches.
Whether it's medieval-style fantasy with mages and knights,
or hard sci-fi takes on the future of space colonization,
or thrillers set in your backyard, world building is the foundation that holds up the narrative, the glue that keeps it from unraveling as readers follow the journey you laid out for them, all to make the stories jump from the pages and burn themselves into our memories.
Welcome, weary writers, to Book Career in a Year's network of podcasts. This is Worlds Asunder, an insightful podcast on world and character building.
My co-host is the one and only David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's the H.Y. Gregor, but you can call her Haley or Sour Patch, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
We know. We have nearly a score of published novels and short stories between us, but who the hell are we to teach you about world building and character development? We get it, which is why we decided to call in some favors.
Each week, we pull from a list of the best and brightest authors, editors, and publishers to give tips and guidance on tackling the age-old questions and provide you with tools on how to accomplish world building like the pros. From environment to magic to characters, how do we strike a balance between what matters to our audiences and what matters to keep it all straight? Open up your ear holes
and your minds
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder.
So, if you're ready,
just knock and enter. What's up, guys? Welcome back to Worlds Asunder, the only podcast on the internet that sponsors the college football team, the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Why? Because I'm a diehard Huskers fan. Go Big Red. Deal with it. As always, I am joined by my co-host, Haley H.Y. Gregor, who always never knows what I'm going to say for the intro and just has to deal with it.
As with our life. So,
hey, it happens. Welcome to being part of my life. So today, we've got a fun guest for everyone. We have a very particular topic we're going to cover with this guest, and so not to bury the lead too much further. He writes fantasy and urban fantasy novels. He'll dabble with sci-fi and horror in short form as well. He is the former president of the Colorado Springs Fiction Writers Group and Pikes Peak Writers. When not writing, he secures computer at the day job and plays way too many tabletop games. Despite having his right arm amputated and reattached after a nasty car crash, he types faster than the average bear. He is the author of the Modern Mythology and Flashing Blade series and is hastily working on more right now. In fact, you could probably see him typing as I read this bio. He joined the Gnome Stew Crew in March of 2016, a TTRPG blog. Highly recommend you go check it out if you get the chance. But since that time, he has written dozens of articles for the site and has earned 3 Gold ENnie awards in 2016, 2017, and 2018 as part of that team. Our guest today is JT Evans. Welcome, JT.
Hello there. Thank you very much for having me.
We're stoked.
Yeah, we were super excited. I've known JT for most of the time that I've lived in Colorado Springs, the second time around now. So about 2.5 years.
It sounds about right. Yeah. Coming up on 3. I think we met at Superstars 2022.
Well, I had started going to beer night with you after Haley left.
Right.
Prior to Superstars. And I think it was because of Mark Stallings. But
yeah, it's his fault.
Well, yeah, we'll blame Mark for all of the
Sure.
things. But yeah, so you have the Modern Mythology series, you have the Flashing Blade series, you have plenty of short stories and flash fiction, and you've dabbled in speculative fiction to include cyberpunk, fantasy, urban fantasy, and horror. But the reason we brought you on today is to talk one of the things that you are really detailed about crafting, and that is how to build a city.
Yeah.
Um, and it's one of those things that has a really fine balance, right? You gotta know how to build it, but also how it's gonna play into your world. Is that kind of a fair assumption there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No city exists in a vacuum unless you have like some weird fantasy setting where there's magical barriers between every city, so the city exists in a vacuum kind of thing. But as far as your typical, let's remove that from the equation. Your weird magic barrier type stuff. Every city interacts with itself internally and with the immediate surroundings that are around it externally. Um, the larger the city, the longer the external reach is going to be. So your small village that's like, say, a mining town, or I don't know, like a lumbering, a village built around lumber from forests. Those may not have as much reach, but it might have more reach than you imagine, because that lumbering town is going to be providing raw materials for the city that's 30, 40 miles away, so that city can be built up and be larger. So it just depends. You've really got to keep in mind the not just the size of the city, but the scope of its reach and impact on the region.
So, when you and I first discussed having you on and talking about city building, I was so excited because we've done a lot of general world building things and we've talked to a lot of different people about different genres, but we've only had one other episode really that delved really deeply into a single, really specific kind of specialized topic. And that was when we had Clark on and we talked about magic systems.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I love this because this is one of the things that it could be really easy for people to get kind of bogged down in it because you get really into the intricacies. But it is something that do you feel is overlooked when people are writing fantasy, for example?
I'm going to say yes to some extent. Not every author overlooks it. The key point is consistency. Meaning, if you say that the courthouse is on the corner of Main Street and Wall Avenue, and then later on the courthouse is on some other corner, your readers are going to pick up on that, and that's where you really need a map. And the map can be a blank sheet of paper, and when you define in your book a fact about your city, scribble a note. It could be a wiki, it could be a plain text file, it could be a Word document, it could be a handwritten note, whatever. But make sure you keep things consistent, especially if you're going to be using a city out of the real world, which is not really the focus of our conversation. But in my modern mythology, first modern mythology book, Griffin's Feather, I had a armed chase scene across a parking lot, and I had used Google Maps with the Google Earth view to go, yes, there's a parking lot full of cars there. And then I wrote the scene, and I went back to my bookmark for that specific view of the parking lot, and I noticed something just north across the street from the parking lot that I hadn't noticed before. It's one of the main police stations for San Antonio. And I didn't have cops in the area. I didn't have, on duty, off duty cops. I had to change that entire scene and basically remove the gunfire, or I had to change the scene after because the cops would come swarming. And I really didn't want that to happen in my story. So it just turned into a foot chase with my protagonist yelling at the guy, "Hey, you, stop thief." So yeah, but just the reality of things changed a scene because I didn't notice the police station literally across the street from the parking lot. And when I zoomed in a little closer on the parking lot, you could tell that like 90% of the cars parked in the parking lot were marked police cars with the light bars on top. And I hadn't zoomed in that far on previous visits to that part of San Antonio via Google Earth. So yeah, it was get your facts straight. And if you're making it up, keep your facts straight.
Yes.
I mean, we're not going to get into real cities too much, but it is worth touching on, because I also, my one novel here, Companion to Ghosts, which you may or may not be able to see above my head, but you can see it in other videos. We use Houston, right? But we were using a future version of Houston, so I was using very much like all the old neighborhood names to try and keep the stereotype there. But I
Right?
could get away with so much more because it was like, oh well, I'm just gonna not name this street, or I'm just gonna assume that certain things of these have changed because we have different kinds of businesses and stuff now, and I could get away with that and not feel
Absolutely.
too
Yeah.
bad about it.
And
So not
also
cheating.
that it's not cheating. Yeah, I want to bring up another point. Don't use real addresses, especially of residential places. And here's why. I actually had a straight up legit street address of a house that my protagonist was breaking into to rescue a ice pixie that had been kidnapped. And my editor was like, no, we can't do that. Mainly because if my books get super popular, my readership might actually go to the house and annoy the person that lives there. And I was like, oh crap, I never even thought of that, right?
Accidental doxing.
Yeah, pretty much. And I didn't have the real name of the person living there because I didn't do a background check on the address or whatever to figure out. I didn't do a public record search to find the real name of the person. I just needed a house in a particular neighborhood on a particular street. And I was like, okay, easy enough. I'll name the street and the neighborhood, but not what block. And my editor was happy with that.
And I think definitely worth noting because even for landmarks, when you think of The Shining, it's the Overlook Hotel, but everybody knows that it was, inspired and based on the Stanley. And
Right.
it's become a huge tourism draw for the Stanley, even though it has its own really rich ghost history aside from that, but that was part of what inspired the book. So that's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I wonder how much business The Shining has driven to the Stanley Hotel over the decades.
It's definitely the main reason I went when I went to go see it. So
I can imagine they enjoyed the uptick in people trying to stay there because I believe that that hotel is actually on the haunted registry in Colorado too.
yes.
Yeah.
So like now, granted, that didn't dry like because I remember going to, and JT, you might know the name of this hotel. There's a hotel down in Manitou that is also on like the National Registry for Haunted Hotels.
Yes, I've been in it. Had a what is the hot toddy? That's like one of their specialty drinks there, right? And it was Halloween time, and we were doing the Halloween street march, and we're there with some friends, and they were like, "Oh yeah, this place is haunted," blah blah blah. So we went into their restaurant and had some hot toddies at the bar and carried on. But I don't remember the name of the place. I can see it. I can see the front of it, but I can't remember the name of it.
That's the point I'm making, right? Is that like the place is already like relatively, at least locally famous-ish. And it was famous enough that Ghost Hunters International did a show there way back in like the mid 2000s. But it is not famous enough that we remember its name. The Shining,
Right.
however, gave us the Stanley Hotel, and everybody knows. And
right.
It was anyway.
Yeah. So on the tangent level, we started off tangenting early. That was impressive, actually. But while we're talking about landmarks, though, JT, you have a note in some of the stuff that you sent us about your anchor areas or anchor locations in a city, which could be your resident haunted hotel. So tell us a little bit about anchor locations.
All right. So I'm going to back up a little bit before going into anchor locations. Typically when I'm designing a city, building a city for a story, I only put as much effort into the building of the city as the story requires. So if I'm writing just a short story, I may have 3 locations where there's scenes, and that's it. I just name them. They may be down the street from each other, across the street from each other, but I'll have 3 what you call them, anchor locations. Maybe I have the protagonist's home, the protagonist's favorite bar, and the location of the police station where they end up after the bar fight. Boom, done. That's it. I don't need a map. I don't need addresses. I need relative distances or travel times, but I don't need anything more than that because I'm not going to spend 2 months building a city for writing a short story that only takes me 5 hours to write.
Right.
So, but for like the Flashing Blades, I knew I was going to have many, many books in the series. So I spent 2 months building Mesnik before I even started outlining the first book.
Okay.
And what I built, and Mesnik is the city that the name of the city that my series is based in. And I knew I wanted an arena, like think the Roman Colosseum type arena. I wanted an open air market, like a square. So I made a note of that. Unfortunately, there is slavery in my story. I do not paint it in a good light, so don't worry about that. But historically, when there's slavery, there's a stage where slaves are sold as goods. So I have a slave stage as well, and I knew I wanted the emperor to live in a citadel with a spire on the backside. Basically, so he had overlook, and it was up on a hill. I knew it would be up on a hill. That way, he would have literal oversight of his domain, with Mesnik being the capital city of the empire. So those were kind of my anchor locations. And then I delved into drawing a map and numbering locations. And I literally have exactly 800 numbered locations in Mesnik. And they're just little squares and rectangles and L shapes and things like that. I'm not an artist. I'm
Okay.
very much an engineer. And I drew the map to be functional, not pretty.
That was the sound of JT realizing that his connection had just defaulted. Now we're going to make a jump cut and return you back to our programming. Thanks for enjoying this technical difficulties.
Oh, you were talking about the slave stage, and then you were talking about the mansion that overlooked the hill.
Sure.
Or the mansion on the hill that overlooked the city, which was the last thing that I caught.
Gotcha. So yeah, the Emperor's Citadel is the last anchor location I have. It's not, and these anchor locations are named on my map. They're not numbered. And then I have an additional 800 locations that are numbered on my map. And there's no way I could write the name of each location in my map. The outlines of the buildings are just too tiny for me to type or write or Photoshop in the name. So I just put numbers everywhere. And then I have a spreadsheet that has 4 fields. One is ID, meaning the number of the location, then the name of the location, what type of location it is, and then a big old wide column for notes. Like, what book does it originally appear in? Who's the owner? Are there any key events that happen in the book at that location? What is the purpose of the location? Things like that. Just general notes, things to remind me, oh yeah, I used that place in chapter 12 of book 2, and they got banned from that particular tavern because they started a bar fight and they can't go back in without getting in trouble. That way I don't accidentally have my protagonist go back to that place and walk in and the barkeep treats them like old friends, because they're clearly not old friends. So and it took me 2 months to do all this. And I knew, and I was okay with spending 2 months building a city because I had plans for many, many books in that city.
So then while you're writing, do you add to that notes column, or is that part of your editing process?
It's as I'm writing. I have Scrivener open and my spreadsheet and my map open all at the same time, and my outline spreadsheet as well, but that's a whole nother topic. So basically I have 4 files open while I'm writing, And I typically don't refer to the map or the location key a whole lot unless my protagonists are moving across town, or entering a new location, and then I'll make up something quick on, they're going into, um, the blacksmith shop, and I'll give it a name. I won't just call it the blacksmith shop, right? It'll be like the Golden Rhino Smithy or something equally fantasy sounding like that. So
I was gonna say you build your locations out almost like most people build characters,
yeah.
which is a very tabletop RPG thing to do, right?
Oh yeah. Oh
Um,
yeah. Cities
for
are
those,
characters. Cities are
yeah,
living, breathing, existing things. That, I mean, they may not be. I heard of. I had a roommate once. He was like, when I was living in Midland, Texas, which is where I was born and raised. He was like, Midland doesn't have a soul. But of course, he came from L.A., which L.A. definitely has a soul. Probably many of them, right? But he was like, Midland is like a dead city because he couldn't feel the city's essence, kind of thing. It was an interesting perspective.
yeah.
I have lived some places where I have felt that way, and not necessarily small towns either. So, how do you create that kind of soul in a story?
Sure.
What's the like your favorite part to work on?
Um, Probably disparate neighborhoods. No city, unless it's super tiny, is homogeneous.
Hmm.
You have the very organized, portions of the city. Those are typically newer because the older parts of the city, they just put the road where they felt they needed a road, which is how you get the really windy, it follows terrain. Whereas the newer parts of the city maybe snap to a grid. And then they're like, oh, grids in a city, it's so ugly and boring. So the even newer neighborhoods will have all the windy, curvy roads because it's prettier that way. It just depends. But you're going to have rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, um, various social strata within the different neighborhoods. You're going to have slums if it's a big enough city. In my case, the slums of Mesnik, I call it the Hive, which is kind of a nod to Star Wars, the Hive of Scum and Villainy
Mm.
line from A New Hope. But it's also organically built and falling apart at the same time, kind of like a wasp nest kind of deal. Nobody has money for a permanent structure, or at least not to maintain one. There are currently documented about 4 different permanent structures, and the Hive is a huge swath of land on the western edge of Mesnik, and it's just shanties and walkways and think your refugee camp style living. But these people are too poor to afford proper housing, so they can't even live in Mesnik, which is 100 yards away, because the quote unquote rich people live in Mesnik, and that's from the Hive's point of view. So
So kind of on that, right? Like you have the almost the separation within yards or whatever, but kind of continuing on Haley's question, how do you create that feel? Do you go back and kind of give it a history, or do you just kind of know that that's what you want and then develop everything from that?
I know what I want, and then I backtrack into a history if necessary. And the history is a big info dump that lives in my brain or in my notes. And it's the tip of the iceberg gets exposed to the reader, because you don't want 87 pages of backstory to say, oh yeah, this is the old neighborhood with the dirt roads. You just say it's the old neighborhood with the dirt roads. And in Mesnik, some roads are paved, many roads are just dirt. Depends on the economic level of the neighborhood. Mesnik itself is not a walled city, so it's not protected from the outside. However, there are two walled areas, the Nobles' Quarter and the Emperor's Ward, because they put walls up to protect themselves. Also, those were the original, not quite original, those were the secondary places where people settled after the city got established. And it was kind of frontier land at the time. So, yeah, you want walls up if you're on the frontier. And of course, those walls have expanded, grown taller, been replaced with stone instead of wood. Just an evolution thing. If you want to see a neat evolution of a wall, look up the Berlin Wall. And for you younger folks, the Berlin was actually cut in half-ish by Russia with a wall. And if you look at the late 80s, early 90s photos of the Berlin Wall, you're going to be like, well, there's no way they put that up overnight. Well, they did, but the overnight version was barbed wire, 2x4s, and chicken wire, and that's it. And it was manned by a lot of guards. So the Berlin Wall evolved over literal decades of growth and expansion. So, yeah, that's an interesting study in city development. Is go read about the Berlin Wall from its inception to its deconstruction, or from its destruction. So, yeah, that'll teach you a lot about cities.
Well, or city separation too,
Yeah,
right? When
city
you're trying
separation.
to look at cultural or government splits, which
Yep.
split is a really polite word for what was going on at the time.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So, all right.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, on Split, you can split your populations up as well, especially in a fantasy setting. You can have your typical humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, so on and so forth, or make up your own species names and species types and all that. But I highly recommend, if you do that, you figure out what your percentage of population is for the city and for each neighborhood. That way you have, oh, he's the only elf that lives in the halfling neighborhood or whatever, right? It'll make that character distinct. Just figure out your percentages of population. That way you know what you're dealing with before you actually start dealing with it.
So you mentioned that you actually have used historical precedents to help determine that for yourself. Do you have any advice on the best way to do that, or the best way to say, oh, I want a city that I think is about this big, but I'm not sure what city or what country I should be looking at historically to get my ideas?
Sure. So for me, I wanted my city to be pre-European gunpowder. China had gunpowder way before Europe, imported it, and gunpowder kind of slowly made its way across the Silk Road and then spread to Europe from there. But I wanted a city that was pre-gunpowder, and I actually wanted one that was like pre-crossbows. I didn't want crossbows. I didn't mind regular bows, but for some reason I was just like, nah, let's go a little older than that. So I looked up, when was the first crossbow, or when was a crossbow commonly used, and a little quick, online search. And I settled on around the year 1000. And so I looked up London around the year 1000, and, it was like, what is London's population at 1000 CE? And its records back then were not the best. Mainly, the first census of England didn't happen until 1068, which was 2 years after William the Conqueror took over England by force. And he had the Domesday Book commissioned. And that was a huge leap forward in census taking. It's like they counted every damn chicken too. It was crazy. But anyway, so around 1000 CE, London is somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people. Found a map of London around that era. Fortunately, it had a scale on it, so I could see how many, what scope it was, how big was London at that time to hold 20,000 people, and then extrapolated from there. So I made my city just a little smaller than London at that time period, but I kept the same population. And what that means is it's a higher population density, so people are more packed in, elbow to elbow. which increases societal pressures
Yes.
because I wanted a little more conflict than the average 1000 London, right? Not, I'm sure there was plenty of conflict there, but I wanted to kind of really pack people in so that I could easily have tempers flare and stuff start to happen.
Well, and the fastest way to get tempers to flare is to pack a bunch of people into a very small space and then just not
Yeah.
give them anything, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Turns out they will turn on each other like rabid animals.
So when you're starting, obviously for that, were there geographic limitations to the like why your city had to stay smaller, or what tools did you use to keep it cramped?
Really, because it's not a walled city, it's an artificial limitation. It's, the author's wish,
Mm-hmm.
my desire to keep it smaller. Um, to the southeast of Mesnik is a good sized swamp. Um, Plains and rolling hills and farmlands and things like that to the east and north. Forest a good distance away to the west. So the city has plenty of room to grow, except for maybe to the southeast into the swamp, because nobody really wants to build in the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a pain in the butt to pull that off. But yeah, so it's a little artificial. I didn't have them run out of resources or run out of time or whatever. It's just, and there are a smattering of buildings on the outskirts of Mesnik that are not as packed in or tight together, and those would be like your farmers' houses or maybe a noble person's getaway, like their country estate kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that sort of brings us to economics, right? We talked a little bit about the kinds of resources. No city exists in a vacuum, but they will have their own specializations, resources, things that they produce versus their needs. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure thing. So every city is going to have imports and exports. I honestly couldn't think of a single city that is like 100% self-sufficient and at the same time has nothing left over to give the surrounding areas. So again, this goes back to the city or city state doesn't exist in isolation. So figure out what goods the city can't make for itself, and there's your imports, and figure out what excess that it creates, and that's your city's exports. And you don't have to go into great amounts of detail about who they import and export from and tariffs and customs and blah 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 and all that, because you're unless you're writing an economic thriller. Sorry, that sounds boring. I know, I'm sure it's been done, but
I might read it. I'd
yeah,
probably read it.
yeah. So yeah, figure out what they need and what they got, and that will give you a baseline for a lot of things like construction materials. If they have a forest nearby but no quarry, the nearest quarry is 1,000 miles away. Most of their buildings are going to be wood, with the exception of like fortified defenses, or the very rich would have stone houses. If the quarry is a little closer, maybe the first story of of all the buildings are made of stone, and then the expansions that were done later, like your upper levels, would be made of wood. And that's actually pretty common for the time period. A lot of London was built that way.
So heavily influenced by geography.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you just need to know what's nearby. You don't need to know. You don't need to delve into the specifics on like how many cubits of wood get harvested every summer or what. Nobody cares, and you really don't need those details. Don't waste your time doing that.
Cubit of wood. Good word.
Unless it's absolutely integral to the actual story moving
Oh,
along.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. If it's important that to your plot or your character development, sure, throw that in there. But most of the time, you don't. You really don't need those details.
Have you ever read or seen, and you don't have to use a specific detail, we don't need to drag anything through the mud, but a city that you said, this is not believable to the point where it bothered you? And if yes, why? And if no, what points would have to be missing or wrong for you to say there's no reason that the city should be able to exist the way that it does?
Sure. So, well, I can't remember the name of it, so it's probably a good thing. But if I did, I wouldn't mention it. It was a fantasy book that had as the author named it, a metropolis, which a fantasy metropolis is going to be different from a modern metropolis. London for its time and almost since its inception has been a metropolis of its age. But the way they had described it, it was like many hours of horseback ride to get from one side of the city to the other. And I was like, you're talking, 20 miles plus in a single day on horseback, barring anything going wrong. Right. And I was like, I just could not envision a city of that size in the time period that the book was trying to reflect. Now, a modern metropolis like your big sprawling San Antonio or LA or any big city, Tokyo, whatever, sure, absolutely, I would buy it. But a pseudo medieval city needing many hours to ride a horse across, I just it broke the world for me. It's like they didn't really do the math. They just wanted it to take the protagonist a long time to get from point A to point B because they were on a clock. There was a ticking clock as part of the plot. And really, they needed to shorten the time period of the ticking clock and make the travel more reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, you said it was like 20 miles. I was like, the last city I lived in that was big enough that could work for was Tokyo, but that's modern day Tokyo. In fact,
Right.
Osaka has almost always been bigger than it for most of the history of the two cities. And to be honest, I think only just within the last 20-30 years did Tokyo actually overtake the size of Osaka. But yeah, no, that's very much a kind of thinking it through, that is very much a product of technology that a city can expand that large. All right, so I've paused the episode here to let all of you know that I'm wrong, ultimately. Essentially, as best as I can tell, Tokyo did not grow Osaka until 1932 when Tokyo City incorporated 20 of the nearby wards and cities. And that's in landmass. Population, as far as population size goes, that's not really what we were talking about. But the confusion might come from either the greater Tokyo area or the Tokyo metropolitan area. But I had thought that it occurred after World War II. It turns out it occurred before. So, also, for our audio listeners, since you won't see the video corrections, to future-proof this episode, the Tokyo metropolitan area is run by the TMG, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, headed by a governor of Tokyo Prefecture and the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly, as well as the individual mayors for each city. Hope that helps. Thanks for listening.
Right. Because if you think about needing to control the domain, you have a mayor or city council, whoever your leadership is of the city. They need to be able to know what's going on at all points in the city, almost at all times. So modern communication methods, cell phones, internet, so on and so forth, that is possible for the head of Tokyo, whatever its title might be, which I don't know what the title would be, but they could know in a moment's notice that some building caught on fire across town. Would they need to know that? No, probably not unless it was a major building. But if you have a sprawling city, it's going to take minutes to hours for the leadership of the city to know something bad's happening or something good's happening, or, hey, there's a horde at the gates that we didn't see coming. Should we close the gates? And by the time the message gets back and forth, it's too late.
You bring up a good point there, and I can keep using Tokyo as an example because it's relatively recent in my mind. But who is in control of the city? How important is that question? Because like Tokyo, right? It's funny because I don't think there's actually one city head. There's no mayor of Tokyo. There are mayors of the different pieces of Tokyo.
There you
So
go.
like Fusa and Tachikawa and all the different pieces that make up Tokyo. Each of them has their own mayor because that's how the system has to run. It's just such a large city, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm sure there's a downtown Tokyo piece that officially has a mayor, but Tokyo as a whole, I believe, does not have one head. It's essentially run by committee. So how important is it knowing that, and how does it affect, how you build out that city? How does it affect the soul of the city?
Very much so. That's a great question. You can have everything from the village elder, the oldest man or woman in town is the leader just by default. It could be hereditary through, matriarchy or patriarchy. Could be the last guy to win the wrestling competition 3 years ago, and so he's mayor for the next 3 years. There could be the city council, the council of elders, a mayor. So like in my case, the emperor lives in Mesnik, but he doesn't run the city. It's actually, he farms that out to a seneschal who nominally runs the city. He's like the head person, but it's really the noble families who truly do run Mesnik. Because they have the wealth and combined influence and power to wheel and deal and backstab and steal and undermine and join forces with and all that. It's very political in the noble families, as it should be, at least in my opinion. So yeah, the noble families are the true power in the city of Mesnik, whereas the emperor is the true power for the rest of the nation. And if the emperor really wanted to oust the noble families, he probably could do so, but it would take military might to do that.
You said wrestling, and the only thing I could think of was Wakanda at that point and how they changed leadership. Which, by the way, Wakanda, in my mind, is a wonderful way of kind of building out a city. Now, granted, they could do it on screen, right? They didn't have to give you a ton of info by character, but they show you essentially kind of almost a city state, right, where most of the nation is just the one city. But how they built that out, how the technology affects how they react as a nation, like how it affects how they do things, but also how their culture from the past affects how they do things. So
don't get me started. The second you start tugging at strings there, everything falls apart. I have a rant.
Wakanda?
I won't bring it to, yes, I won't bring it to our listeners.
Next time on Worlds Asunder, we have an argument over MCU cities.
City, singular. Oh. So when it comes to government structure, or legal structure, or your criminal justice system, your law enforcement, where do you suggest people look for inspiration, or do you think that should be something that historically they look at? Do you advise people totally make their own? How important is that?
You can make your own, totally make your own. However, I would recommend basing it in some level of reality, because that is going to be common ground with your reader. And also legal enforcement procedures and laws and crimes and all that good stuff have been codified fairly universally for a very long time. Yes, there's lots of exceptions. Don't get on Twitter. I'm not even on Twitter. Yell at me on Twitter if you want. I won't see it. Don't get on social media and yell at me and say, no, there's all these exceptions. Yes, there's exceptions. I'm talking generalities. Get the generalities down and make your own exceptions.
I'll go yell at JT on Twitter.
Yeah.
Hey, your internet is down again.
And in true Worlds Asunder fashion, we ended it with some technical difficulties. We hope you learned something from JT as he discussed anchor points in city building, and we delved a little bit on the side of using real cities to influence your world building, as well as me getting some facts wrong about different parts of Tokyo. Don't worry, I'll probably do the same next week. Thanks again to Nick Thacker and Book Career Network for hosting us. You can catch us on any of the links in our show notes, especially Haley, who's going to be at Author Nation next week. Make sure to stop by and say hi. And don't you worry, JT will be back next week for the City Planners Committee Part 2. Just in case you were missing him. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, thanks for helping us tear the worlds asunder. We'll see you next time.